So before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands we're meeting on today and pay my respects to elders past and present, to other Aboriginal people in the room, and for all of you for making it. I feel like there's more and more people coming to every class. It's great. Thank you for coming. It is certainly a much nicer day today than it has been when we first started. Before we actually start, I was reading the news this morning, which I do every morning, partly because I don't want to get out of bed, and it's a good reason to stay in bed. And I just wanted to read a little bit of two articles that I came across this morning that were in relation to the topic. Now, can you all hear me at the back? Is this on? Actually, have I got this on? Oh, no?
I don't think it's working.
Just needs to go up. Okay, it's almost all the way up. Maybe I just need to move this up. Is that better? Radio mic up. Can you... Hang on. No? Yeah, it's working. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me. All right. Let me read these articles to you. So, one is about Toto Sainsbury, who is an Aboriginal man who just passed away. He has spent a lot of time... Actually, I'll just tell you about him. So, Toto is an Aboriginal man from South Australia, and he passed away last night. And I just wanted to mention him because he is somebody who has worked tirelessly on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander criminal justice. So, he has been involved in South Australia in implementing the Royal Commission's... let me pull this up. I know the acronym and I never remember. The Death in Custody. The Royal Commission to Death in Custody, which was 26 years ago, I think it was 25 years ago, that was actually introduced. He has worked on treaty and a whole range of things. So I just want to mention that we've just lost somebody who has been doing a lot of work in this space and is someone who has been very significant in the South Australian community. It is people like him which have actually driven the changes that we see for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it's the reason why people like me can stand in front of you guys is because of the amazing people that have come before me. So he is somebody who I have met, who I have spoken to, who I have interviewed as a journalist, and have to say it's a great loss to lose him. And he died from lymphoma, so they knew it was coming. The other one that I actually want to read to you is something that, again, isn't very great, but is not great for a whole different reason. So on Saturday night, an Aboriginal woman was robbed, assaulted, broken ribs, and was taken into custody herself, even though she was a victim for unpaid fines. And I'm going to read you the first couple of paragraphs of this story from NITV. So when we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander injustices, when we talk about all of the stuff that has happened in the past, you remember that history lesson? It's still happening today. An Aboriginal woman left with broken ribs sustained in a violent robbery over the weekend feared she would die in custody when WA police jailed her for unpaid fines. Keenan Courtney Dickey, 34, was only released from jail through the Free the People crowdfunding campaign run by Sisters Inside Debbie Kilroy, who were able to pay her fines. Her treatment has led to further pressure from the WA government to change the laws that disproportionately target Aboriginal women. Ms. Dickey has been hospitalised on Saturday night with a broken rib after she was robbed by two men who stole money and phone in Perth. After the attack, Ms. Dickey sought refuge in a McDonald's in Perth suburb of Inaloo, where workers called the police and an ambulance for help. She was then taken to the hospital and was told she had a broken rib. While at the hospital, police from Scarborough Station had notified Ms. Dickey that she had outstanding fines, which they advised her to deal with in coming days. But when she went to a different station, Mirrabooka, the next morning to give a statement, she was instead arrested. I thought the officer was coming to take my statement, but instead he arrested me for fines, Ms. Dickey told NITV News. I was terrified. I had never been arrested or gone to jail before. An injured Miss Dickey was placed in the back of the paddy wagon where she was transported 35 kilometres south to, I can't say that, Melaleuca Remand and reintegration facility scared in my life, she said. I was in so much pain because I'd never been hit by anyone before. My ribs were hurting. I was so scared and I couldn't help think of a case of Miss Do because they were so similar. The death in custody of Yamatji woman Miss Do, who died in police custody after being picked up for unpaid fines in 2014, had brought national attention to the issue. Miss Do died in agony over her pain, which stemmed from an infection from a broken rib, which was repeatedly ignored by police officers and health workers. In Western Australia, under the Fines, Penalties and Infringements Notice Enforcement Act 1994, Western Australia, if a person defaults on a payment arrangement, an arrest warrant is issued and they are detained at a rate of $250 per day until the fine is paid off. Miss Dickey had a total of $750 of unpaid fines, ranging from unpaid speeding tickets to fines from transport officers for failure to show her healthcare card. She had asked to pay off her fines through community service, but was told only court-issued fines were eligible for community service. I'm just going to leave it there. Western Australia is the only state which actually jails people for unpaid fines. It disproportionately affects Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly women. And if you can stop and think about what if someone is a single mum with $750 of unpaid fines, what happens to their children when they're in jail for 3 days for unpaid fines? So I know it's not what you wanted to start your morning on, but that is the reality that we wake up to every morning. When I'm looking at newspapers, that's what I'm looking at every day. And these are people that could be my family. So let's talk about human rights. What do the UN conventions say? There's a bunch of things in the UN conventions which are not necessarily in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, well, the Indigenous one. So this is in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It says no one should be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention or exile. So essentially that means you can't just pick someone up off the street and arrest them because you feel like it. Everyone is entitled to full equity to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal in the determination of his, this was written when we did not use gender neutral terms, and obligations of any criminal charges against him. Essentially that means that the judicial system needs to be impartial. We have that in Australia, which is great to some degree. Everyone charged with a penal offence has the right to presume innocence until proven guilty. I'm sure all of you know that. No one should be held guilty of any penal offence on account of any act or omission which did not constitute a penal offence under national or international law. Nor shall be a heavy penalty imposed than was applicable at the time of the penal offence was committed. Okay. So that is the human rights. There are other things within human rights as well. So everybody has the right to an interpreter if English isn't the first language. There are specific rights for children in terms of how children are treated under the law as well. Can anyone tell me what the age you can be charged for an offence is in Australia? Yeah, 10. So at 10 years old, you can be charged with an offence. There are moves to actually have that increased in Australia to the age of 12 or 14, depending on who you talk to. And we just actually had a young Aboriginal man present at the UN on this particular issue. When I say young, he was arrested when he was 12 and he's still in his teens, so I think he's about 14. He was not, luckily enough, sent to jail. Does anyone, so in the article that I read you just then, does anyone, you heard me talk about Ms. Do. Does anyone know about Ms. Do? Yeah? Someone want to share the story, what you know of it? Yep. Anyone else want to elaborate? Yep.
Yeah, I believe she died of septicemia.
She died of septicemia.
Yeah. Blood infection and
You're
was left untreated and uncared
she died of septicemia. So her partner and her had been involved in an altercation. He had assaulted her. She was in the cell next to him. She was crying out in pain consistently. She was taken to hospital 3 times during the time she was incarcerated. Well, she was in lockup. So she was only in lockup as well. So she wasn't in jail. So she was under police custody. And each time that she went, no one took her observations. So blood pressure, checked her heart rate, anything. Nothing. There was no observations done. The policeman who actually took her had indicated that he believed that she was faking it. And she subsequently died unnecessarily while she was in jail, and her partner was next door listening to her screaming and crying for help. And even though he obviously inflicted the broken rib, he was listening to her die and asking for help. So when we think about human rights, when we think about being, and while they were only in lockup, not necessarily in jail, we need to think about how we treat people before they even get to the criminal justice system. The other thing that I'd like to say is I want you to think about what you probably heard from the racism lecture last week. I'm sure Marlene talked about unconscious bias. Yep, because I wasn't there, I can't be sure, but I know Marlene well enough to know she would. So I want you to think about that in particular when you're thinking about what we're actually looking at when we talk about criminal justice in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'm going to take you through some stats. I don't often do that, but what I want to do is actually show you why this is a very significant issue for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We have a history in this country of locking up Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. If you remember, if you have a look at the slides from the first week, or you happen to be here in the lecture for the first week, you might remember the photo I put up of Aboriginal people chained up. Aboriginal people, one of the ways you actually destroy a community is by removing men and children. And so that is essentially what happened in the past. And we have, as I said, a history of criminalisation. When we talked about the stolen generation, I don't know if you remember, I talked about how one of the men who had actually been a member of the stolen generation, when he went to court as a teenager, what he thought was the first time he was going to court, he actually was told by the judge that he was going to get a harsher sentence because he had a criminal record from when he was 2. The criminal record was him being removed as a child. So before we actually had family court like we do now in the legislation we have now, to actually remove a child from their family, the child had to be charged with neglect. So the child then had a criminal record that was charged, so the child was charged with neglect. So all of our children that were removed under that system had a criminal record before they were even at the age of 10 to be able to, which is when we actually now charge people. We also have a history of not actually treating people fairly in the court systems. So one of my colleagues was involved in the review of the Indigenous Legal Assistance Funding Scheme, which is known as ILA. It's funded by the Attorney General, the Commonwealth Attorney General of Australia. And when they went down to the APY lands, there was children in adult courts. So children are meant to have children's courts, which have specific needs and supportive services around them. You had children being tried in adult courts. We have a system in Australia where Western Australia actually defunded its only translated services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So under the UN conventions, you are meant to be able to be tried in a language that is suitable for you. English is often not the first, second or third language for many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly in northern part of Australia. So Northern Queensland, Northern Territory and Northern Western Australia. So we have a system in Australia which technically should actually mean that we adhere to our conventions and also the rule of law. However, we often don't. And this obviously is significant as well for people who might come from other countries, where English might not be the first language. So I'm going to take you through some statistics, and I want you to remember that there is a history here behind these. So what we can see is the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is obviously a lot less than the non-Aboriginal population. We are, after all, only 3.3% of the population, so it's not surprising that the actual number. And what we can see is that the number of non-Indigenous people being incarcerated is actually going up, and so is the Aboriginal population. And what's interesting about that, actually, is the crime rate is going down. Across Australia, crime rates are going down, but people are actually being incarcerated at a higher rate. There is not a lot of evidence around why that's happening, so it could be a whole range of factors. It could be that we're getting better at actually convicting people, so as technology increases, we obviously see better results in terms of we could have tougher criminal justice laws. So, for example, more recently, and when I say more recently, in the last 10 years, I think it is, in Western Australia and Northern Territory, they've actually introduced mandatory sentencing laws. So when you've actually had 3 strikes, you automatically get sentenced. So there's a range of factors at play here. It's a good question, though, and it is a question I think we need to be looking at more into. So, what are Aboriginal and Torres Strait people and non-Aboriginal people most likely to be incarcerated for? I think it's really important to actually look at what the offences are, because most offences that people are incarcerated for are not the ones that are going to make the news. They're not the violent crimes. They're not the sexual crimes. Homicide, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people commit less homicide, significantly less. We are more likely to cause injury, however, so that's assault. Non-Indigenous people percentage are more likely to commit sexual assaults than non-Aboriginal people. We are more likely to commit robbery. Aboriginal people are more likely to unlawful entry with intent, so that's just bad criminals who are likely to try and rob someone but don't actually get that far. We are significantly less likely to be charged with illicit drugs, so this is proportionately, and we are offences against justice, which that'll be resisting arrest and a whole bunch of other things. So, does this surprise anybody? Yes? No?
What surprises me is the huge gap in certain things, because you would think that there wouldn't be such differences according to certain crimes.
Yeah. I mean, the one that grabs my attention the most is the illicit drug one. Yeah? What do you read in the media about us? This grabs my attention because even as an Aboriginal person, I see constantly that we are charged with drug offences, right? And yet, if you actually, I will almost 100% guarantee, if you did a media analysis, you would find that Aboriginal drug use features much more prominently than non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander drug use. So when we're thinking about the fact that we are significantly more incarcerated, we are significantly less likely to commit homicide and sexual assault. And when you think about what was being talked about Aboriginal men in particular within the Northern Territory around the intervention, which was actually introduced because there was a fear of sexual assault, which was actually deemed to be not as prevalent as they had anticipated. Anyway, I thought that was very interesting, and that's at June 2018. So all of these are the most up-to-date stats that I could find. Where do we incarcerate people the most? Western Australia. Does that surprise anyone, given the 2 stories we've talked about this morning, Ms Dickey and also Ms Dew? We have reasonably consistent incarceration rates across the country generally, internationally. But what we can see is that Western Australia incarcerates Aboriginal people. And what you have to ask yourself when you're looking at such significant rates. So, for example, New South Wales has the largest number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the country, in total numbers. We only make up just over 2% of the the New South Wales population, and yet we are significantly less incarcerated. So you've got to wonder what's happening in some of the states and territories when they have such high rates of incarceration. Because this is looking at Northern Territory as well. Northern Territory has about 85,000 Aboriginal people, and yet it makes up about 3% of the population. So there are differences in the states and territories, and I think that's really important to remember as well. Is this one of the reasons I put things like this up is because when we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we often think about same. There are differences across every state and territory that are because of history, because of current legislation, and because of different Aboriginal communities in and of themselves.
So what's going on in Tasmania?
There's a lot less Aboriginal people in Tasmania per capita. So it would be nice to think it was because that they were doing better down there, but yeah, this is numbers as opposed to proportion. So, and I think that's one of the things that's actually really interesting about this, is that Western Australia and Northern Territory, so Queensland and New South Wales have, by and large, the largest Aboriginal populations. Trying to think of what they are. I think it'd be close to 550,000, which is probably about 3/5 of the Aboriginal population within those two states and territories, and that's might be slightly dodgy math, but I'd have to. Wouldn't be too far off. So yeah. Victoria has quite a small Aboriginal population by comparison. So overall, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 28% of the Australian prisoner population, and we are only about 3.3% of the Australian population. So we are significantly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And if we stop and think about this for a second, talk about social determinants for me. What do you think this does in terms of social determinants?
Situation would be better if there's rehabilitation in prison.
Absolutely. That is one of the cornerstones of prison. Prison is meant designed for three things. Punishment, rehabilitation, and protect society from people that are unable to help themselves, for a lack of a better word. So yes, rehabilitation would be wonderful, but is not something we invest here in Australia. We're just building more prisons. Yes, so you're right. So give you some examples. So if you're in government housing, for example, you lose your government housing when you enter prison. If you're on the waiting list for public housing and you go into prison, you go to the bottom of the list. When it comes to health, for example, thank you, that's all right. When you actually go into prison, you are no longer under Medicare. Did you know that? So everyone in this room is under the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. So when you go, you get subsidised medication. You may not know you get subsidised medication, but you do. And you also are under Medicare. So you get subsidised healthcare or free healthcare. When you enter prison, the states and territories are responsible for your care. So what that means is you can't go into prison with any medication. They don't allow it because it could be dodgy, it could be contaminated, a whole range of things. So you then have to be assessed by a health practitioner in the prison system, which could be that take days. So if you've got diabetes and you need insulin, if you've got high blood pressure and you're on blood pressure meds, all of those actually have to be prescribed by a prison doctor. Not only that, you actually then, if you're in a job, you lose your job, obviously. So you can imagine how entering prison, in particular, impacts your life in significant ways. there are people that definitely need to be in prison. Violent crimes and sexual crimes are something that are abhorrent, and I certainly do not endorse that. When it comes to other crimes, I think at times we are a bit over the top, particularly, and this is a very personal opinion, when it comes to drug offences. Non-violent, non-sexual crimes, drug offences, it should be a health issue in my opinion, as we treat alcoholism, because addiction is not solved by prison. Anyone got any thoughts or comments?
Well, prison should be last resort. It's been practiced.
Yeah, I think it creates a cycle as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it depends. I actually was involved in the ILAP, so I was telling you about that colleague of mine that went down to AP Warrens and the child was being was in a criminal court and an adult court. I actually was involved in that as well and went to one of the sites and spoke to some magistrates. I spoke to two magistrates. One of them believed that it was actually a last resort. One of them just believed Aboriginal people were kind of criminal. And I had to sit in their office with my best poker face and listen to this particular magistrate talking about just that this particular community that he works in, they're just a bunch of criminals, basically. So I think there is variation, significant variation in the criminal justice system amongst the magistrates. And I have to say, actually we'll talk about that later. I'm going to steal my own thunder. Let's get through this. So, a little bit of a comparison. So we've seen an increase of 5% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being incarcerated and 4% for non-Indigenous people in the same period. One of the things that I think is the most significant, and this goes back to the cycle that you were mentioning, Alex, was around 75% of Aboriginal prisoners had actually been in prison before. And there is a correlation between contact with the juvenile justice system and also out-of-home care. So when we're thinking about social determinants, thinking about how a cycle occurs from early childhood. So I'm going to take you back I'm going to go back to the 40s. Say you were a Aboriginal child born in the 40s, you were removed from your care. You were put from your parents' care. You were put into a residential school where really it wasn't a school, it was just training you in menial labour because you were actually too dark to really be able to be civilised according to the policy at the time. So you never got a formal education. You then went and actually worked, and you were working, but of course, because you were Aboriginal, you didn't get your wages, so you couldn't build up any wealth. So you were given a small amount of money, the rest of it was put in trust for you, which you never saw because the government stole it. And in Western Australia, they literally built roads with it, is the story. And so by the time of 1968, when we've actually had the Wade Hill walk-off, when we've actually seen Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people being able to make, the Commonwealth being able to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, you are now 28. So you have no formal education, you have the skills of menial labour skills, you now need to pay equal wages to a non-Aboriginal person, and so you actually can't get a job. You end up actually homeless on the street. You then develop significant health issues, you develop mental health issues, and you then, of course, people like sex, you end up having sex, unprotected sex, you have a child. That child is then taken away because it's not in the care of somebody who can literally take care of a child. You can't really take care of a child on the street. That child ends up in a foster care home. That person then moves from home to home with non-Aboriginal people, disconnected from culture, and because they move from home to home, they're incapable of actually getting a proper education because they have to change schools all the time. So then they actually start playing up because they're so far behind, they actually can't do the work, and so by the time they reach year 7, they're playing up. They're playing up, they get kicked out of school, they end up roaming the streets and getting up to no good. They have minor offence after minor offence, and they end up actually getting involved in an assault, they have a blow up with someone, cycle continues. So no longer are they at school, no longer are they able to do any work, they have a criminal record, they have no skills per se, and so the cycle of past generations is being perpetrated in future generations. So that is a pretty common story within the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, those cycles can be broken. I'm standing here to say that they can be broken because our family certainly did. But it's not an easy thing to do, and everybody sitting in here would probably think if they were in the same situation, it would be very, very challenging. So, 75% end up back in prison, whereas only 50%. And so that's the other thing I want to say though is, lots of Aboriginal, you will hear the statistics, around 28% of the people in jail are actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but what you often finding is it's a revolving door. The same people are coming in and out. So I couldn't track down this statistic again, which is why it's not in here, but I have a recollection that only 12% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have ever been to jail. So when you hear the statistics, you actually think that it's a hell of a lot more, but most of us have never been in jail. Juveniles. This is the bit that gets me the most angry. (10 to 17 in detention, 59% in June 2018 were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and yet they only make up 5% of the population. Pretty big numbers, huh? Indigenous people are 26 times as likely to be in detention on any average night. And 58% of people were in unsentenced detention. 48% were sentenced, were Aboriginal. Does anyone know what unsentenced detention is? It's on remand. For those that don't know, it is people that are actually incarcerated awaiting trial, essentially. Either they haven't made bail. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to be incarcerated, are hugely likely, young people are likely to be in jail and yet to be convicted of crime. So some of the reasons behind that is because the court deems that there is no safe place for them to go. So that there is no guardian that may look out for their welfare and make sure they abide by their conditions of bail. So a young person could be in jail and actually found not guilty, or found to be guilty but not be sentenced to a custodial sentence. And this could be for weeks or months. And this is a child as young as 10. So, and we're talking about small numbers as well. In New South Wales, we're talking about 300 or 400 young people. So while the stats look really, really, really big, the numbers of young people incarcerated are actually really small. So in New South Wales alone, when you think about the size of New South Wales, we actually can't, in this state and territory, find a place to put about 200 young people. I think you've seen this before in one of the cahoots or one of my shoots. So this was Mick Gooder. He's the former Social Justice Commissioner, and he was actually a commissioner on the Dondale Royal Commission. That's not its formal name, but that's what I know it as. It says, our young people do not belong in prison. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that, but we don't seem to have a solution at this point in time. And that's one of the reasons why I do this lecture, is because all of you are going to go out into the workforce, and you might go as health professionals, or you might go out as policy makers. I don't know what you're going to do. But thinking about how we can break this cycle is everybody's responsibility. And I think it's really important that we not just focus on individual behaviours, but actually look at the systems and structures which help maintain the status quo. And this was from Just Justice. So that was your reading this week. Well, you didn't have to read the whole book, but 3 of the articles from it. This is a bit blurry, sorry guys. Again, just wanting to show that there are differences in what occurs in different states and territories. So you need to remember that every community is going to be different. I just don't have community stats. So you can see from South Australia, the top one is an act intended to cause injury. We can see that in Queensland, for example, the rates are significantly different than they are in each other state and territory. And again, if you have a look at, say, for example, offences against justice, which is the bottom one, the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people are more likely to be sentenced juveniles for that. And you can see the differences around the states and territories. I won't go into the details of it, but this is really just to highlight, when you're thinking about statistics, you've got a national picture which says one thing, but then as you get more and more local, from state and territory to, say, local health district, to then individual town, you're going to see individual variations. And the reason why I say that is because when you're thinking about solutions, if the statistics are different, then there's a different story behind those statistics, so therefore the solutions are probably going to be different. You might be able to borrow some solutions from other areas where it seemed to work, but each of them are going to need to be adapted. This one-size-fits-all model doesn't work. Right, so what are the factors driving incarceration? I've talked about some of them through this lecture. So we're talking about a loss of land, and that has two issues. Firstly, it's loss of land in terms of culture and connection. Negative treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, being rounded up and put on missions. I think I've told you before, my grandmother grew up on Kamagunda. It's a mission down in on the border of New South Wales and Victoria on the Murray River. And it is not a nice place, I can tell you. I've been down there, and it is somewhere that I'm very grateful I didn't grow up. They weren't allowed to practice culture, they weren't allowed to speak language, they essentially were controlled. And the first case study that you had from that first week, you probably realised not too far into it, was actually the story of my life, of my family. Culture and spirituality, so again, being disconnected from culture. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander law, LORE, not LAW, was actually our stories, our kinship, it was our law systems. It was actually a complete package in terms of how our lives were lived. It had our histories. It taught us morals and ethics, and concepts in a Western context that are applicable. So it was a comprehensive package. When you when you actually dismantle those structures, and we actually see when you dismantle communities and structures all around the world, you look at war, after in war-torn countries, you look at all of the systems and structures are dismantled. There is lawlessness, there is anarchy, and there is hopelessness. Social disadvantages, obviously, the social determinants, when we talked about them. There's a clear correlation between poverty and incarceration for a whole range of reasons. Poor people can't afford the legal service, and even though legal aid is fantastic, and so are the Aboriginal legal services. So there are two systems in Australia. You have Aboriginal legal services and legal aid, which is funded by the Commonwealth as well as Aboriginal legal services. Aboriginal legal services are designed to meet the needs of Aboriginal people specifically. Legal aid meets the needs of anyone who doesn't have the money. We also have community legal services as well, which are in addition to that. And we also have family violence legal services, and there are Aboriginal-specific family violence legal services. Discrimination. So again, there is discriminatory policies. New South Wales actually had a policy directive, which we don't know a lot about because their policy is considered to be private for a range of reasons, but it was called STOP, where it identified juveniles that they considered to be at high risk. The majority of those were Aboriginal, and this was something that the people that were identified under this were not notified that they were actually identified as high risk. So they had significant amount of stop and searches, a whole range of things. So they were watched significantly more, which actually developed where these young people felt very targeted and felt that there was they had a lack of trust in the police. And then lifestyles. I mean, lifestyles are really bad words. It makes it sound like you're just living on the beach or you decide to have a tree change. But this really talks about the behaviours that we might end up getting us in front of the criminal justice system. Behaviours which I might say, so when I consider drug and alcohol use, I consider those to be symptoms of other issues. I mean, or quite frankly, it's an addiction. So there are two things. Hardcore drugs, some people get involved in them to lose themselves, the same with alcohol, and then it becomes an addiction, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that life becomes worse if you take more. And we are more likely to be overrepresented in everything. There was a study done looking at disability, which I think is the next slide. Yes, there we go. Disability. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are more likely to be incarcerated if they have a disability. There was a study done in the Northern Territory that found about over 90% of Aboriginal juveniles incarcerated actually had a hearing disability. We're also more likely to be incarcerated if you've got fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Who knows what HAS350 is? What's HAS350? Yeah. And it's really hard to diagnose unless it's really significant. Excuse me, so FASD, yeah, developmental issues, they have poor impulse control, they potentially have speech issues, they have lack of attention, they find it challenging to make decisions, complex instructions won't be able to be grasped, so cognitive disability. And we actually have people in jail with FASD that have never actually been charged, Aboriginal people. So when Mick Gooder was the Social Justice Commissioner, there was a particular case of a woman in the Northern Territory who had been in jail for a number of years without being sentenced because she was deemed not to be capable of being sentenced, but this was not her first offence. And because some people with FASD are quick to anger, and so she had been deemed to be a risk to herself and a risk to other people, and we had nowhere else to put her but in jail. They're more likely to spend longer in prison. So a lot of people with a hearing disability or who are deaf have one of their ways of coping is agreeing. So we'll often find that particularly young people in front of the court system will just agree and not necessarily be able to defend themselves to the full extent because of their hearing disability. And most of the people they actually found in the Northern Territory had never been formally assessed for hearing. And cognitive impairment, again, is something that is a significant risk factor for people becoming incarcerated. So that is somebody who's not able to process information well, not being able to actually understand the risks of their behaviour, a whole range of things. So I think it's really important when you're thinking about criminal justice, you're thinking about all of the factors that may play into how someone ends up in front of the court system. It doesn't mean they didn't do the things that they're accused of. What it means is there might be other factors at play here. And again, people with a cognitive disability, in terms of their capacity to think rationally and logically, it's reduced. So sometimes, even though they physically look like an adult, their behaviours are more like a child or a teenager.